So first of all, my apologies for the confusion on the time difference between Lisbon, Portugal and Perth, Australia. The mistake was mine alone, and I apologize to you all for that, and thank you for your understanding. And let me begin by welcoming and thanking our distinguished guest from Australia, Professor Mark Bison, whom I will introduce in a moment. I'd also like to welcome our students and all the participants in this webinar. Notice that this conference is being recorded and that the link to the recording will then be made available on the Observare and IDEAN websites. This conference is part of a vast cycle of webinars associated with Advanced Studies course on Asia-Pacific that the Autonomous University of Lisbon and the Research Center Observare organize in partnership with the National Defense Institute. In previous weeks, we had conferences and roundtables with Portuguese experts. And next week, on May 6th, we will have more open conferences with Professors Toshimi Nohara from Japan, Konstantin Xavier from India, and Robert Sutter from the United States. After Professor Mark Bison's talk, we'll have a discussion period where all participants can ask your questions and make comments either viva voce or via chat. But without further ado, I'm now introducing Professor Mark Bison, whom we once again thank the honor of being available to share his many insights and perspectives. Professor Mark Bison is one of the world's leading experts on the geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics of Asia-Pacific. He is a professor of international politics at the University of Western Australia, and before that, he taught at universities of Murdoch, Griffith, Queensland, York, and Birmingham, where he was also head of department. He is the founding editor of Critical Studies of the Asia-Pacific book series, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Titles in the series cover the politics, economics, and security of the region, as well as focusing on its institutional processes, individual countries, issues, and leaders. The book series is Scopus Indexed. Mark, again, many thanks. The stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Luis, and I'm so delighted to be here. And I'm even more delighted that it wasn't my fault about the time difference. So that would have been mortifying and horribly embarrassing. So let me see if I can share my screen with you and get this working. Anything happening here? Let's
minimize the Zoom. Yeah. Now you can.
Let's just play this. Be right with you. Slideshow, play from start. How's that? Good?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks again for the invitation. And this is what I'm going to talk about: China, the Indo-Pacific, and the Quad, because the rise of China is, I think, the biggest thing that's happened in my lifetime, and that includes the Cold War and many other things. And this new idea about the Indo-Pacific and the so-called Quad is a very big deal in this part of the world, and it could be a big deal for the future. So I'll say something about all of the above and give you a little outline of what I'm going to talk about. So one of the big questions I think that's worth thinking about and talking about is the fact that the region itself has been redefined and relabeled, and so it's worth thinking about what the consequences of that are and why that might have been an attractive thing to do. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. I'll talk about what that might mean for China, because in my view at least, this kind of redefinition of the region is in large part a response to the rise of China, and it's seen by some states in the region as a way of dealing with China and possibly even containing it. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. And if you have any questions as we're going along, you can stop me if you want to, but I'll leave it to Luis to organize that. But let me start anyway. So here's a map of what we used to call this region, which was the quote unquote Asia Pacific. And as you can see, it's a huge area, and arguably that's been a bit of a problem because it's such a big area and includes so many countries that are so diverse and have not very much in common with each other, that it was always a bit difficult to persuade people that it was a useful way of thinking about that. Oh, I've got a typo in Pacific, I'm afraid, but anyway, I'm sure you know what I mean. So, but anyway, The idea of the Asia Pacific suited policymakers in the United States because it offered them a way of engaging with the region and helping to legitimate their engagement with the East Asian part of the region. It also suited policymakers in my own country, Australia, because all of Australia's major economic partners are now in East Asia, particularly China and Japan. And so they are tied to the region, but they also wanted to include the United States because the United States is the big security guarantor for Australia. So this idea of the so-called Asia Pacific suited Australia, suited America, and it became the way of describing the region for a long time. And for the Americans, as I mentioned, people talk about the so-called hub and spokes relationships in the region, and it's like the spokes of a bicycle. Washington is the center of the wheel, and radiating out from Washington are a series of bilateral security relationships with individual capitals like Canberra, Philippines, Thailand, Japan, of course, South Korea. These are key bilateral strategic relationships of the United States. And for a long time, it seemed to make a lot of sense to describe this region as the Asia Pacific because that captured a lot of the kind of strategic relationships of the United States in particular. However, IOs are international organizations, and there was a sort of fairly well-known international organization called APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And arguably, I don't know how many of you have actually heard of APEC. They're very excited about it in Australia, or they used to be, but it hasn't really had much impact on the region at all. And that's partly because the agenda of APEC was overwhelmingly focused on economic issues, trying to promote free trade, which many people in East Asia weren't that interested in because that's not been the way that East Asia really developed economically. And we can talk about this later on if you want to. But the other reason that APEC failed was it was just too big. I mean, what has Russia got in common with Peru, or Mexico got in common with Singapore? It's just not obvious what the links were in this huge area called the Asia Pacific. And in addition, there's been a whole series of competing organizations and initiatives regionally that have emerged to compete with APEC. So APEC was already experiencing some problems over the years, and that made it easier for new initiatives to be put forward, and perhaps explains part of the attraction for some policymakers, at least, in this idea of the so-called Indo-Pacific. Now, let me remind you of what this part of the world looked like before Mr. Trump and the new president, Joe Biden. Under President Barack Obama, the United States undertook what was then called the so-called pivot to Asia. This was the idea that America had become too focused on the Middle East. They needed to rebalance their strategic policies away from the Middle East back to Asia, particularly to deal with the quote unquote rise of China. The big expectation under Barack Obama was that the Americans would have withdrawn from the Middle East and they'd be able to concentrate on responding to this challenge of China. Now, as we know, the Americans didn't manage to pull out of the Middle East, and Joe Biden has now said they're going to pull out of Afghanistan, and it seems as if that's going to happen. But they're still engaged in the Middle East in a big way, and there's still a question about how easily the United States can respond to the rise of China strategically. Interestingly, in Australia, there wasn't a great deal of debate about whether this was a good policy or not, because Australia has always supported the United States, no matter what it's done. And just by the by, at the moment, the Biden administration is emphasizing climate change and the need to do something about the environment, which I think is an excellent idea and should have been done a long time ago. But it's going to cause some real problems for the Australian government, because the current government in Australia is not interested in environmental cooperation in any serious way, because we are still, rather embarrassingly, the biggest exporter of coal in the world, and it's still a huge and important industry in this country. So there are a number of countries around the region, however you describe it, that are caught between different economic and strategic priorities, and Australia is one of them. However, Australia has generally been supportive of anything that looks like it's going to keep the United States engaged in the region, and this pivot to East Asia seemed like a good idea. In reality, it didn't amount to much under Obama, and there's still a big question about whether it's going to amount to anything under Joe Biden, but that's another thing we can get to. But as far as Beijing was concerned, I mean, if you look at the map, China is surrounded by American bases to its east, and to the west, there are some fairly unfriendly and unstable neighbors occasionally. I mean, they've had terrible relations with Russia over the years. There's a big dispute about who's the most important power in Central Asia, Russia or China. So China lives in a pretty difficult neighborhood, and it's not happy that there are all these American bases right on its doorstep, which it sees as a threat to its sovereignty and strategic independence. Anyway, Trump didn't resolve these problems, and he reprioritized America's strategic interests above everything else. And famously, he had this kind of transactional attitude towards policy, and even managed to fall out with the Europeans and NATO, which has been seen as the kind of major foundation of strategic relations in the Northern Hemisphere amongst the Europeans and the Americans. So Trump did a lot of damage to America's strategic relationships in the world. But interestingly, he was a big supporter of this idea and started to use the language of the Indo-Pacific. Now, it's interesting to think about the history of the creation of this new idea about a new region in this part of the world. And interestingly, Japan was one of the first countries to champion this idea of a new way of thinking about the region under Abe Shinzo, or Shinzo Abe, depending which way around we're doing it. He was a big champion of the Indo-Pacific, and he was supported in this idea by Australia, because if you look at the map, Australia is pretty much in the center of the so-called Indo-Pacific, and it includes all of the key countries with which Australia either does business or has strategic relationships. And if they can get the United States to be a key player in the Indo-Pacific as well, then that's clearly going to be seen by some strategic thinkers in Australia and Japan as a good thing, because it will keep America strategically engaged in the region at a time when strategic policymakers in both countries are very, very concerned about the rise of China. And if you know anything about the history of relations between Japan and China, you'll understand why that is a very important and, from a Japanese perspective, fairly scary kind of relationship, because there's a lot of history between those countries, and frankly, they don't get on terribly well. So that's a bit of a problem. One of the interesting things about this Indo-Pacific idea was the possibility that India could be involved in the Indo-Pacific as well. Australian policymakers have somewhat belatedly and only fairly recently kind of realized that India is going to be strategically and economically important as an actor in this part of the world. And they've been trying to persuade various Indian governments to play a more active role in this region, and as we'll see, to be a member of this kind of Quad organization I'll talk about in a moment. But I don't think there's any doubt that from the perspective of Australian and Indian policymakers, of Japanese policymakers, the big idea of getting India involved was as a more effective way of quote unquote balancing China's rise. And if you know anything about international relations theory, as I'm sure you all do, then you'll know that for a lot of kind of realist thinkers, this idea of balancing against rising powers or potentially threatening powers is one of the kind of fundamental principles of international relations for realist thinkers. And there are a lot of them in Australia, the United States, and Japan. I don't know enough about India to say, but I think their position is much more fluid, uncertain, and developing than the other three members of the Quad. However, as I point out at the bottom of this slide, if any of these ideas about regional identities and ways of thinking about regions in different ways, if any of them are to amount to anything, then states have got to kind of do something with that idea, and they've got to institutionalize it. And as we saw in the previous slide, whatever else APEC may or may not have done, it did offer one way of trying to institutionalize a basic way of thinking about an otherwise fairly unconnected, uncoordinated region. So giving an idea or a description about a region some kind of concrete institutional identity is an important kind of step in this process, I think, at least. So here's the Indo-Pacific, and one of the things that this map demonstrates, I think, is the importance of sea lanes in the nature of Indo-Pacific geography. And it's kind of interesting that geography and some of the people who work in political geography in particular have done some of the kind of most interesting work in thinking about what drives these kind of regional relationships and why they might be important at different times. And as you can see, a lot of the world's trade goes through the Indian Ocean and across the Pacific, and China is still heavily reliant on flows of energy from the Middle East, and very, very concerned about its strategic vulnerable in the Straits of Malacca, which are just around Singapore. And this is what strategic thinkers call a quote unquote choke point, and somewhere where Chinese energy supplies could be easily disrupted in the event of a war or a conflict, or wanted to send a kind of threatening message to the Chinese. So China's pretty paranoid about that vulnerability. And that's one of the reasons why China has been rolling out this so-called Belt and Road Initiative and building oil pipelines through places like Burma to try and reduce that strategic vulnerability that you can see on this map. One question to ask about this is whether it has the same kinds of problems as the Asia-Pacific idea, whether it's too big, has too many potential countries involved, should it include the United States, who are essentially a kind of Pacific power, and they're a long way away from the Indo bit of the Indo-Pacific. So some people have written and argued that including the Indian Ocean as part of the United States kind of strategic horizon or worldview is just too much. It's too big an area, even for the United States, to be able to realistically extend an influence. And even if they could, what would India think about it? Because India has been a very ambivalent and somewhat reluctant member of the Indo-Pacific at times. They have their own kind of relationship with China, which can be a bit difficult and violent at times. They've had a big war with India in the past, and there's some big border tensions in northern India at the moment. So India has some problems with China, but they also want to have their own kind of independent relationship with China as well, and not necessarily be tied into what suits the Americans or the Australians for that matter as well. So up until now, there's been a question about whether this kind of idea is going to be successfully institutionalized. And even if it is, what would it be institutionalized to actually do? What kind of values or norms or ideas would the Indo-Pacific region be trying to promote? Because the Asia-Pacific was primarily about improving trade and international economic cooperation, whereas there's a question about what would the Indo-Pacific region actually be about? What kind of ideas would it be actually trying to promote? So interestingly, Mr. Trump, in his famous presidency, amongst all the other things he did, most of which were fairly unsettling and disturbing for friends and allies alike, one of the things he did begin to talk about in the last year or so of his presidency was the Indo-Pacific region. And he described it as the kind of Indo-Pacific dream. And it was one way, I mean, at one level, it's just kind of rhetoric. But at another level, policymakers in Japan and Australia were delighted because they've been trying to push this idea and get the Americans to buy into it for a number of years. And surprisingly, to some people at least, it was President Trump who started to use the language and make this the centerpiece of American foreign and strategic policy in this region. And if you read American defense reports now, they all talk about the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific. So at one level, that's just a form of words, but it means something in terms of the thinking that underpins that. And there's no sign at this stage that the Biden administration is going to change that new way of thinking about the region, because I think if they did, they would upset Japan and Australia, who are arguably their two key allies in the region, and they would kind of just add a new degree of uncertainty to what are already pretty uncertain relations in the region. As I mentioned before, Trump's policymaking style was described as being transactional because it was always about America first and about what American allies could do for America. And Trump thought that America's allies should do more of the burden sharing, as they call it, should spend more on defense, should be more self-reliant, and should reward the United States for the supposed defensive relationship that they offer to allies in the region. And this is a quote from Mr. Trump about what he thought about the Indo-Pacific. And it's interesting that they've been emphasizing cooperation, wealth, freedom, and this stuff about freedom and servitude. I mean, I think it's a fairly unsubtle criticism of China, because a lot of the American allies have been supporting America in its criticism of China's conduct in Xinjiang, Tibet, its threats towards Taiwan, its bullying of Hong Kong and repression of freedom of speech and human rights in places like Hong Kong. So there's no doubt that China has been behaving fairly aggressively and unpleasantly and repressively at times. And I think this language that has become associated with this new Indo-Pacific region has been intentionally designed to emphasize the so-called virtues of the what we'll see as the Quad partners in a moment, who are all democracies of one sort or another. There's a bit of a question mark about the state of democracy in India at the moment under Mr. Modi. I don't think it's unfair to say, but they are different kinds of regimes than China, and they have potentially more in common with each other than they do with China. So that's part of the kind of discourse that's accompanied this rise of the Indo-Pacific. So what about the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific? Now, as I mentioned, Japan was the real pioneer of this kind of idea of the Indo-Pacific. And Mr. Abe used to talk about a so-called security diamond. And this is what he meant, this kind of shape in the middle of the region, which was built around this kind of evolving strategic relationship between the so-called Quad states. That's India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. So this was Abe's kind of big idea to try and create this kind of security relationship as a direct response to the rise of China, which, despite the level of economic interaction between Japan and China, which is very, very significant, although declining, despite that economic interdependence, Japan's always seen the rise of China as a potential threat. So we have the emergence of the so-called Quad states, these four countries that are all democracies and all concerned about the rise of China. But any time that you have even an informal alliance of states for some reason, they're always allied with each other or cooperating with each other for some purpose, and usually against some other country. And it's quite clear that one of the reasons that China hasn't been invited to join the Quad is because the kind of subtext of the plot of the Quad is a strategic response to the rise of China. So it's not surprising that China hasn't been invited to join, and that China is a bit paranoid about what the Quad means for its future and its strategic independence. So we've seen the emergence of closer bilateral ties as well between the Quad members. Japan and Australia have recently signed closer defense agreements. Countries are trying to encourage India to establish closer bilateral ties with other members of the grouping. And there was a recent set of military exercises called the Malabar exercises, which Australia had left about 10 years ago under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, but has rejoined significantly last year. And even though, you know, Australia's strategic significance is not that great in the region, the symbolism of Australia being invited back into this series of military exercises was pretty significant, I think. And so at that level, the symbolism was quite important. And I think China certainly took notice of the fact that there were greater levels of quite high profile strategic cooperation between the members of the Quad. And this idea of the Quad could give some real institutional substance to the Indo-Pacific, depending on how it evolves. Now, at the same time that this is happening, it's worth pointing out that China has, one of the reasons people are concerned about it is not just because China is spending more money on military hardware, which countries tend to do when they become richer, but it's still nothing like as much as the United States spends on military hardware, we should point out. But what China is doing is using its growing economic importance. And some people think that China may already be as big an economy or possibly bigger than the United States. But if it isn't, it soon will be if we kind of extrapolate from here, because China is still growing and there's a question mark about how rapidly America will continue to grow. That's a complicated debate. But anyway, what we can say is that China is unambiguously a much more important economic actor in East Asia in particular than it was 10 years ago, never mind 20 or 30. And every country in the region, including Japan, including Australia, and including South Korea, their biggest bilateral trade partner is China. And China has been quite willing to exercise what people describe as geo-economic leverage or power to persuade or cajole or urge partner economies to behave in particular ways. And at the moment, Australia is subject to a whole series of forms of economic tariffs and boycotts by China that have made life quite difficult. The only thing that hasn't been subject to new import limitations from Australia to China has been iron ore, but that's simply because it's difficult to get it from anywhere else. And China needs a lot of iron ore still at the moment because it's still building lots of internal infrastructure and development. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, it's important to remember that the economies of Southeast Asia are much, much smaller than China's. They are all heavily reliant on China as a trade partner, although not as much for investment because Japan is still very, very important. But they are relatively weak compared to China. And some leaders of Southeast Asian states, this is Mr. Duterte from the Philippines, shaking hands with Xi Jinping. He has been hot and cold in his relationship with China. It's cooler at the moment, but he's typical of Southeast Asian leaders who have tried to develop friendly relations with China because they think they may get investment and that they may get preferential trade deals or whatever. And some countries, particularly Laos, Cambodia, maybe Burma or Myanmar, they are very dependent on China economically and very reluctant to do anything or say anything that will criticize China. So some people have begun to talk about the possibility of developing a new so-called tributary system in Southeast Asia, which would look a bit like the one that China had in the region a couple of 100 years ago, when smaller states in the region acknowledged China's dominance and China was the regional hegemon. An interesting question to ask is, and David Kang, a prominent international relations specialist in the United States, has argued that when China is stable, the region as a whole is stable and it's good for peaceful, cooperative relations and economic development. So one question to ask, which the Americans won't be very happy to hear, is would Chinese hegemony be any worse than the American version? Because it's worth remembering that America's been involved in all of the kind of big regional wars, Korea, Vietnam, and if you can count Afghanistan, there's been a 20-year war there as well. So there's a question to be asked about the stabilizing effect of American hegemony versus Chinese version. So what about Joe Biden? Is this going to make a big difference to the region or American foreign policy as we've seen it over the last 4 years, the last 8 years, the last 50 years, depending on what kind of things you think are important? There's been an interesting series of articles written recently about the so-called blob. And this is a way of describing the foreign policy elites in the United States, which have historically dominated the policy-making process and have been big promoters of the so-called rules-based liberal international order, which you may have read about or heard about in the kind of literature. Now, under Donald Trump, the blob was kind of pushed to one side and didn't have as much influence, and there was a very different kind of style of policymaking under Trump. Under Biden, they're back, and many of the people who are currently part of Biden's team were part of Barack Obama's team when he was in power. So there's an expectation that we're going to go back to business as usual under Joe Biden, that they'll be able to promote this thing called the rules-based liberal international order, and that we'll see something pretty familiar in the style of American policymaking. Now, that may be true, it may not be true. We don't know at this stage, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. But Stephen Walt, who's a prominent realist scholar in the United States, thinks that the blob or the foreign policy making elite in America has a lot to answer for, that they're not sufficiently in tune with the realities of a rapidly changing world, that they overestimate America's ability to be able to restore the rules-based international order, if it ever existed, because it's worth remembering that America has been involved in wars for over 90% of its history as an independent country. So it's one of the most violent countries on earth, externally and internally. So there's a bit of a question about how real the rules-based international order ever was. But even if it did exist, there's a question now about America's power and influence compared to a rising China, because not everybody thinks that China's rise is a terrible thing. The Russians are pretty happy about it, and there's a number of other autocratic regimes around the world that are not necessarily admirers of democracy, have not been supporters of America's interventionist foreign policy in the past, and might not be all that worried about some competition of that sort in the international system. So we don't know how this is going to play out. To be fair, though, Biden's been, I think, surprisingly impressive in his first 100 days, particularly, in my view, at least anyway, in the emphasis that he's put on doing something about global climate change. And if there is one area that looks promising in restoring some kind of cooperation between the United States and China, it's over climate change, because I think both countries now, now that Trump's gone, both countries recognize that if we're going to do anything serious about climate change, then the United States and China are both going to have to be involved, and they're both going to have to cooperate to some extent at least. And maybe that is the kind of new feature of the kind of blob and its orientation to policy making that might make a bit of a difference in the future. Having said that, some people think that we're about to enter into, or we already have entered into Cold War II. And as you can see, it's become fashionable kind of idea in China as well. And the parallels with what the United States did with the Soviet Union are kind of attractive superficially. But I think, for what it's worth, that this is a very different kind of set of relationships between China and the United States. The Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was a very ideologically driven state. And that was always a defining feature of the old Cold War. Now, despite the fact that China is notionally a communist country, in reality, it's another capitalist state, in my view. And so the challenge is not ideological, even though there are different types of capitalism in the world these days. China is not wanting to or trying to overthrow capitalism, as the principal form of economic organization in the world, even though it might think that its form of capitalism and its form of politics and governance is more attractive, better, and even more efficient than the American version. So I think there are real and important and hopefully encouraging differences between the relationship between China and America and the Soviet Union and America. And hopefully the fact that America and China have this hugely important economic interdependence and relationship, which they never had with the Soviet Union, hopefully that means that there's too much at stake for either country to risk having a conflict, and that will ensure that peace prevails between what some people call the G2, America and China. So hopefully that's the way things will turn out. So what can we say by way of conclusion? I'll wrap it up here. So one thing I think to take away is that there's nothing natural or given about regional definitions. People make them. And if you've done any other international relations theory and you know about constructivism, this is what constructivists are always talking about. The fact that discourse, ideas, identities are important things in defining the way that people think about themselves and the geography that they actually inhabit in different parts of the world. So regions are made through discursive practices and processes of institutionalization. It's not clear whether the Quad is going to be realized as an important institution, but given what China's doing, and it's hard to understand some of the things that China's doing because they seem to be alienating just about every country in the world in one way or another, and they seem to be fulfilling all of the alarmist claims that many realist policymakers have made about China and the threat that rising powers pose. If they wanted to fulfill all those kind of expectations and frighten everybody to death, they couldn't have done a better job, in my view. So, but having said all that, is it likely that any regional grouping will survive without China in it? Will it just be a small group of allied states who are primarily devoted to trying to contain the strategic threat posed by China? And if that happens, will it actually reproduce some of those old-fashioned Cold War style tensions, animosities, and suspicions that we saw in the last Cold War? Maybe the people who think it's Cold War II will be proved right. I don't think they will, but it's a possibility given the way that China's been behaving. Having said all of that, if you ally yourselves in 4 countries, declare themselves to be the Quad, start exercising militarily together, start intensifying their strategic relationships, I mean, how do they expect China to respond to that kind of behavior? Clearly, China is going to be concerned and possibly even more paranoid than they are at the moment. So it's, as they say, something of a two-way street, and that these kinds of relationships are interactive and they kind of help to constitute each other. So if you start treating people as a threat, as a menace, as something that needs to be contained, I mean, you can expect them to respond in a similar sort of way, it seems to me. But anyway, I'll leave it there and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mark, for this excellent and stimulating presentation. We are now open the Q&A period. So I ask the participants to do their questions, whether using their own voice or chat. Questions or comments? Carlos, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very inspiring. I think I on the same wavelength as you are about Cold War II, but I think that more important than economic interdependence, the issue that makes this relationship totally different between the United States and China, totally different from the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, is Taiwan. And I think that there is no way that we can overestimate the importance of Taiwan for China, and also in a sense for the United States, in a sense that the United States very much depends on its allies, its hub-and-spoke relationships in East Asia, perhaps also in the, with India now. And if they were seen to back away on the Taiwan issue, their alliances, as you mentioned, which are not on very firm ground in the last, the same in Europe actually, but could just break away. So I think this is a very, at once a very special and a very classical issue, but it's totally different from anything that we can think about in the, when we look back to the Cold War.
No, I agree. No, it's an excellent point, and I didn't talk much about it, but it's worth saying a few things about it because you're absolutely right. For both the United States and for China, Taiwan's a really kind of pivotal issue. I think even more so for China. And it's interesting that I used to go to China quite a lot, and I think in all the visits I've made to China, I've met one person, I think, who didn't think that or thought that the Taiwanese ought to be able to make up their own minds about whether they want to be part of China or not. Everybody else, intellectuals, ordinary people, everybody else thought Taiwan belongs to us. It ought to be reunified. What's the matter with the Taiwanese people? Same as Hong Kong. They're traitors. They're embarrassing China. It's a disgrace. Got no sympathy for them whatsoever. Xi Jinping has made a big point of saying this is something that we need to solve. And I think, you know, it would look good for Xi Jinping if he was the man who restored Taiwan to China, if he could have that on his CV, as it were, as something he'd accomplished. That would be, from his perspective, a fantastic result. The big question, of course, is can it be done without starting World War III? And then the question is, what would the Americans do if the Chinese did decide it was worth the risk of invading Taiwan? Because it wouldn't be easy, but if they thought it was worth the risk of doing this, what would the Americans do? I mean, my guess is they would send some powerful messages. They might move the fleet a bit closer. Whether they'd actually want to get involved in a shooting war with the Chinese that could risk World War III, it's an open question, and I'm not sure at all personally. But you're right that if they didn't fulfill their so-called alliance obligations to one of their most important sort of client states, nobody would ever have any confidence in American security guarantees ever again. So the stakes for the Americans are enormously high. But a colleague of mine, Hugh White, has written about this extensively. Don't know how well known he is in Portugal, but his question is, will the Americans stay in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, or is it only a question of time before they also, you know, they're going to pull out of Afghanistan? Maybe they'll eventually pull out of the Asia-Pacific to some degree, because they'll, you know, what's the benefit for them? How committed are they to defending this liberal international order at any cost? Because we've already seen that, I mean, I think in America itself, there's an overwhelming majority of people now who think that, as they did in the period between the two wars, that these are other people's problems. We don't get any benefit from it. Why are we spending all this money and effort on other countries when they should be looking after themselves? And whether there's the appetite to commit to those relationships and the defense of places like Taiwan, it's a really interesting and open question now. And if I was advising the Biden government, and I'm glad I'm not in a way, but it's really hard to know what you would advise them to do. I mean, make strong noises and do all the things they're doing at the moment, but if the Chinese invaded, I don't think I'd be saying, well, let's send over the Fifth Fleet and start nuking mainland China, because where would it end? Because once you start a war like that, I mean, the chances of it spiraling out of control very, very rapidly are pretty serious, I think. So, yeah, but it's an absolutely crucial question. Yeah.
Thank you. We now have a question from Sergio Ribeiro, please. I'll give you the word.
Can you hear me right now?
Yep.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Professor. Just had a small comment on Taiwan just now, and I wanted to ask you, what is your view on the current level of engagement between the Quad countries and Taiwan? Because as you said, this is a key question. And I would think the USA and the Quad countries have a myriad of concerns in terms of international policy, but the main, maybe the only existential concern for China is sovereignty, and Taiwan is the key piece in that. So are the Quad countries approaching Taiwan in a way? And that was the first question. The second one, you mentioned about maybe a lack of common identity in the Indo-Pacific countries. Would you say that an identity as democratic nations could be enough to ensure a common identity? Also through a differentiation between the self and the other being China, of course. So
okay,
that would be the questions.
So on the Quad engagement with Taiwan, I have to say I'm not too sure. I don't think there's been much formal discussion amongst the Quad members about what they would do about Taiwan in any kind of conflict situation. There has been in Australia some discussion recently and some suggestion that in the event of a conflict over Taiwan, that Australia would feel, as it always does, duty bound to get involved and to do its kind of duty, as it were. So I think Australia could be relied upon, and there's an expectation amongst policymakers here that they kind of ought to indicate that in a not too subtle form to China. But I don't think there's been anything like as much statement on the part of certainly India, and I don't think Japan. I have to say, I'm not entirely sure what Japan's position vis-a-vis Taiwan is, but it's an excellent question. I should find out. So, but I'm not too certain about that. But I think as a formal grouping, not that it is a formal grouping entirely, but that I don't think it's been at the forefront of their discussions so far. But your other point about is the fact that they're all democracies, a unifying sense of identity is also a good one. And I think certainly Australia and the United States might like to make a lot of that, because I think it's a fairly unsubtle way of criticizing China and its lack of democracy and suggesting that there's something better about these other states as democracies that brings them together. But as I mentioned in my talk, there's a bit of a question mark about India's status at the moment, because I think Modi's come in for a lot of criticism recently, particularly about the COVID disaster and various other things. But they've got some serious internal problems, and I think their reliability, their kind of international identity is a bit more sort of questionable than some of the other Quad members might like. But I think it is that whole thing about national identity can't be underestimated. And going back to China's attitude towards Taiwan, I mean, I think one of the problems that people have to recognize about China's attitude is that for somebody like Xi Jinping, it's impossible to backtrack from where they are now, because he's made all these claims about Taiwan's absolutely something we must get back. It's non-negotiable. Nobody else can tell us what to do. It's a question of sovereignty. So the idea that there could be a negotiated settlement in which Taiwan remains or becomes unambiguously independent, I just don't think that's a starting thing for China and Xi Jinping in particular, because there would be such a loss of face over that I don't think the Chinese people would forgive him. So you're absolutely right. Those questions of identity are really important. But, you know, paradoxically, maybe China's renewed sense of the importance of national identity and sovereignty is more important than everybody else's. And that's going to make them really difficult to deal with, because at least there's a bit of kind of room for negotiation amongst the so-called democracies, maybe. But I just don't know how that's going to work out over Taiwan in particular.
We have now
Thank you very much.
a question from Paulo Santos. If Quad can confront China with all the Chinese power and potential.
Sorry, I missed that. Can you say that again?
If Quad can confront China with all the Chinese power and potential.
Can it confront effectively?
Well,
the short answer is we don't know. But I think the hope is just simply by trying to present this common front of these four important and you know, potentially powerful countries, that China will be deterred. And again, that's the kind of classic language of balance of power politics, that a rising power can be deterred from behaving badly because it sees a coalition of potentially more powerful forces ranged against it. And as I mentioned in the introduction, my talk, that America still spends a lot more on weapons and armaments than China does. And if there was a conflict, I mean, I don't think anybody would win, in inverted commas, but there's no way that China could defeat the United States, I don't think. I mean, you know, one of the problems, if that's the way to describe it, is that in the contemporary era, when weapons systems are so incredibly powerful and dangerous, and things can spiral out of control, the very idea of winning a conflict doesn't make a great deal of sense in the kind of way that it might have done in the 19th century, when you could not only be, you know, have some confidence about winning a war in some sense, but you could actually benefit from it. You could take advantage of the territory that you conquered. Whereas in the contemporary era, I think most people who've thought about this seriously recognize that the dangers of conflict between major powers like China and the United States are so incredibly high that you simply cannot risk it happening. And that's why we've been fortunate enough to enjoy an era of very low incidence of interstate war. It's partly because of the sheer danger of contemporary armament systems. And I think most people, we hope, recognize that reality, and that's helped to contribute to enduring peace. But it's interesting that people like Graham Allison in the United States has just written a very prominent and widely read book about the possible inevitability of war between the United States and China, because that's what the kind of historical lesson suggests, looking back over hundreds of years, about a rising power will seek to challenge the existing dominant power and replace it if possible, or try to create a new system of international order that reflects its interests. So, I mean, I just don't think that is a feasible option or possibility personally, and I don't see how it could be done. But that doesn't mean to say that people might not be able to take the risk. And one of the things that I've kind of joked about on Twitter is the possibility that Russia and China might be coordinating their actions. And, you know, just as a sort of thought experiment, I mean, I don't think this is going to happen, I hope, but I mean, what if Russia and China were saying to each other, well, we'll invade Ukraine, you invade Taiwan, we'll do it on the same day at the same time, America's not going to do anything. I think that would be a pretty safe bet. But on the other hand, you wouldn't want to, you know, I don't think I'd want to take the risk that, well, maybe we can be sure America won't do anything, because at the very least, I think they, you know, have to protest strongly. But anyway, that's, who knows, it would be, but as a thought experiment, it's kind of interesting that if you got somebody like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin running their respective countries, and maybe they've got internal problems, there's no better way than distracting people than having an external conflict or war or trying to, I mean, remember when Putin invaded Crimea or took it over or annexed it or whatever we call it, his popularity shot up. And if Xi Jinping could get Taiwan back, he would be forever regarded as, in the same breath as Mao and everybody else, as a hero of Chinese history. So who knows?
Thank you, Mark. We have two more questions. One coming from Paulo Ferreira is asking, in your view, if China is really a threat, a concern?
Is China really a threat?
A threat or a concern or a challenge to the world, to the US in about 30, 40 years, both in economic terms and the military front? A second question coming from Joanna Locke is, if Quad, that is gaining more and more importance, is a threat for other institutions, just like ASEAN, APEC, East Asian Summit, and so on.
Okay. Okay, well, on the first one about China being a threat, at some level, I think it undoubtedly is, because over the last few years, China has undoubtedly been behaving more, some people say assertively, some people say aggressively, but it's been trying to demonstrate a degree of control, particularly over the South China Sea. And I haven't got the map in front of me now, but yes, over the South China Sea and the East China Sea, China regards some of those places as its kind of sovereign territory. I think its claim to territorial ownership or control are very dubious, but that hasn't stopped China from militarizing some of the islands in the South China Sea and asserting itself and alarming some of its neighbors in Southeast Asia, because they share the South China Sea with China and have their own claims, like the Philippines, Indonesia, other countries, Vietnam in particular. So there are potential areas of disagreement and instability in those areas. China's also having territorial disputes with India. It's also making threatening noises just generally about what it can do to other countries. So I don't think there is any doubt that China is much more consequential and important and potentially threatening than it used to be. There's just no doubt about that at all. And it also presents a major economic challenge to the United States. And it's interesting, one of the things that's come out of both of the COVID crisis and the growing rivalry between the United States and China is there's been an increasing concern about so-called production networks and the way that global production is organized across national borders, and the fact that the United States is highly reliant on imports of Chinese hardware. There's a lot of concern about technical issues like 5G and the activities of Huawei, things that I don't entirely understand, I have to say, because it's a generational thing, but people are very concerned about them and worried about China's ability to be able to influence these in the future. So strategically, and perhaps even more so in the long term economically, yes, China is a major challenge. Whether it's a quote unquote threat economically, I think it kind of depends on the kind of view you take about these things and what you see as the costs and benefits. I mean, it's worth pointing out that some of the biggest investors and some of the biggest beneficiaries of trade with China are actually American companies. And I think I'm right in saying that Walmart, the American supermarket chain, is something like China's 6th biggest trade partner on its own. The reason American consumers are able to have all these cheap products is partly because they're able to take advantage of what is still relatively cheap labor in America. At another strategic level, the ability to be able to produce semiconductors and chips for things like producing cars has been highlighted recently, because there's only a few companies producing these things. Quite a few of them are in Taiwan. So if China did take Taiwan back, they'd also get control of the world's semiconductor industry and production as well, which is as a byproduct of the process. So that's kind of interesting as well. So some of these things go together, but if you take an optimistic view, I think the degree of economic interdependence is at the moment still so great that it makes the calculation of strategic competition different. But it's interesting that many countries are now starting to rethink the whole benefits of globalization and to reshore jobs and industries because they don't want to be vulnerable to China. And Australia at the moment is trying to find new trade partners that aren't China, basically. So we won't be as exposed and vulnerable to China, and to even think about reviving the manufacturing sector in Australia, which virtually died off because we thought we could rely on globalization. And now it turns out, well, maybe we can't. So there's been a bit of rethinking about that. As far as the Quad being a threat to other institutions is concerned, I don't think it is really, because it's a different kind of institution. And there's a big question mark about how effective the existing institutions are in the region anyway. There's a whole series of them. ASEAN, the East Asian Summit, APEC, there's a couple of others I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a lot of them. Most of them don't do terribly much. Most of them people, even me, can't name off the top of their head because they don't have a huge impact. One of the institutions that ought to have a big impact is the so-called ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a security organization in the same way that the Quad is beginning to become a security organization. The ASEAN Regional Forum includes all of the big countries of the region, including China, the United States, Japan, India, even North Korea is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. So it should be perfectly positioned to do something about regional security issues like Taiwan, like Korea, but in fact, it does absolutely nothing, arguably, because it doesn't want to offend the members, it doesn't want to embarrass them or make them lose face, and it doesn't want them to risk leaving the organization altogether. Because if the ASEAN Regional Forum said, we're going to sanction China or we're going to try and punish it in some way, China would just leave because it's not interested. Ditto the Americans. So there are limits to what these institutions can do. So I don't think the Quad's a big threat.
Thank you. Two more questions, one coming from Sonia Gomes. She's saying Biden is using an economic plan to challenge China by creating new infrastructures, creating jobs and boosting labor in American manufacturing. Is Biden's domestic policy also a foreign policy to contain China's global power and growth?
I don't know if it's a policy to contain China in that direct sense, but it's certainly in part a response to China, because Trump, you remember, got elected partly by saying he was going to bring jobs home. It was all China's fault. They were robbing America. And I think that discourse and that way of thinking about China really cut through to a lot of the American population, and for good reasons, because a lot of good manufacturing jobs did disappear overseas. There's no doubt about that. So I think it's a very popular political idea in the United States at one level, but it's also becoming a popular strategic idea as well, because I think increasingly there's a consensus even amongst the so-called blob and the policymaking elites in the United States that the United States is exposed to China, that it is vulnerable to China cutting off supplies of certain things, or not being quite holding America to ransom, but certainly being able to exercise some economic leverage over the United States and other countries. And I think a number of countries now, like Australia, like the United States, are starting to, and Europe too, rethink some of the benefits of being closely tied to China economically, because China might seek to use that leverage at some future time to persuade them to behave differently. So I think we're seeing quite a major rethink about the benefits of globalization, and just any foreign trade is good foreign trade, that kind of mantra is not as fashionable as it once was, I don't think.
Mhm. And Palma, your question, please.
Good afternoon. You have been mentioning maybe some points that I had doubts about, but concerning Australia in particular, isn't Australia too tied not only by trade but also by investments to China to keep up this rising tension? Especially, I think that in agribusiness and mining, which are two main sectors for Australia's economy. Isn't Australia too dependent? And also something that I'm curious about, there is, I would think that maybe over 1 million Chinese or Chinese descendants in Australia. How do they react to these tensions between Australia and China?
Yeah, no, excellent questions. The question about dependence on China, that's become very, very prominent recently, because certainly the current government thinks that we are unambiguously too dependent on China, and that China has been using this kind of leverage very explicitly and making life very, very difficult for for Australian exporters. There was a thing on the news this evening about Australian wine exports to China have dropped by 97% in a year. And that's kind of just one example of a whole series of forms of trade with China that have been very badly affected deliberately by Chinese tariffs and go-slows and customs and inspections and all kinds of strategies. So the trade relationship has been badly affected. The Chinese have been unhappy with Australia because Chinese investments, you're right to point out, in agriculture, mining sector, they've been subjected to much closer scrutiny and in some cases rejected by the Australian government on strategic grounds. And the Chinese are not happy about this. Huawei's had a hard time in Australia. And I don't know if you know, but the port of Darwin, which is the port in the north of Australia, which has become an American base recently, was actually rented to or leased to a Chinese company for 99 years, a few years ago. And many people in Australia thought this was a disastrous strategic blunder. And it looks as if this is going to be revisited now. There's talk now of possibly cancelling the contract and throwing the Chinese out, because some of the strategic thinkers in Australia thought that if the Chinese ran the port of Darwin, they would use it as a kind of spy base to keep an eye on the Americans and what they were doing, and it would be a kind of forward deployment for China. So they are rethinking those things, and there's real policy debates in Australia at the moment about the wisdom of being too close to China. And this has played out into the second part of your question about the kind of Chinese diaspora in Australia, because there are a lot of people of Chinese descent in Australia, and there have been episodes of racism towards Chinese people generally, including some of my Chinese academic friends have found themselves bizarrely on the receiving end of some of this stuff. But I think there's I don't know if you've heard of a book called Silent Invasion by Clive Hamilton, but it became very famous in Australia because it claimed to explain how China's, what's it called? There's a propaganda department, basically. I can't remember the name of it now, but how the Chinese propaganda department, which is linked to the Foreign Affairs Department, was using its influence in China and ethnic Chinese people to create certain perceptions in the community, to criticize Australian policy, to try to influence Australian politicians. And there's been a couple of scandals in Australia where prominent politicians have had to resign because they've been found guilty of taking money from Chinese entrepreneurs. So there's been a whole series of public concerns about growing subtle influence from China through the kind of Chinese community. Now, in reality, it might be a handful of people who are actually involved in this process of directly trying to influence politicians or business deals or whatever it might have been. But unfortunately, quite a lot of the ordinary Chinese community, I mean, some of whom have never even been to China. They've grown up in Australia and they're basically Australians, the same as everybody else. But they've been kind of considered in this kind of bracket of Chinese people who may not be reliable or friendly or trustworthy. And that's had a very negative effect on the kind of local relations and the kind of local Chinese population. So unless this is carefully managed by the government, which hasn't got a good record so far, but unless it is carefully managed, then this could go badly wrong because, you know, it would be most unfortunate because Australia's had a very successful record historically of successfully managing immigration and being dependent on immigration. And a lot of the Chinese diaspora has made a huge contribution to the development of Australia economically and in other ways. So there's a lot at stake, and it's important that we try to manage it well, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Two final questions, one from Carlos and the other from myself. Carlos is asking if the Quad could be enlarged, for instance, to Canada, considering the Five Eyes groups. And my question is related with RCEP. You didn't mention the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership signed last November.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I, of course, share with you serious doubts using the term Indo-Pacific. In my point of view, RCEP is a very good example of the contradictions in the region, because it's much more an Asia-Pacific agreement than an Indo-Pacific. India didn't sign, but Japan and Australia, as their country, New Zealand signed with China, which is another contradiction because including in Australia and Japan, they are also talking on decoupling, but they are making more agreements with China. Yeah. And this is related also with CPTPP, now without US. President Biden said nothing on return back to the old TPP, but Xi Jinping said that maybe China would join with CPTPP. So I'd like to hear your comments on these contradictions.
Okay. Okay. Well, on the first question about the Quad expansion, I mean, if Canada said they wanted to join, I'm sure they would be looked on pretty favorably because another democracy, another champion of liberal values, blah. I'd be surprised if they did want to join, actually, because it's not obvious what would be in it for them, although they've had problems with China famously, and there's 2 Canadians still locked up in China who are kind of diplomatic hostages. So, you know, maybe it might not be inconceivable that they might be interested because they've had a difficult relationship with China recently as well. But I would be a bit surprised, but there's plenty of things that surprise me these days, so can't rule it out. But on your question about the different agreements, the RECP is kind of an interesting one. And I think it's more kind of East Asia than anything else in a way, and a kind of embodiment of China's influence in some ways, because it looks as if it's a kind of very kind of China-centric agreement. However, having said all of that, I'm always a bit skeptical about trade agreements because they don't seem to have had a dramatic and measurable impact often on actual trade relationships in the region. A lot of this stuff's been driven by the private sector and happened in spite of, not as a result of, some of these trade agreements, and you know, APEC being the kind of classic example. So I don't know how much direct impact they would have, although having said that, China has offered favorable trade deals to some of the Southeast Asian countries as part of these kind of trade agreements, because there was formerly the so-called charm offensive when China was going out of its way to reassure its Southeast Asian neighbors. that it was friendly, a good neighbor, it wasn't a threat to them in all those kinds of ways. So maybe these kind of trade agreements could be one way of doing it. Who knows? I mean, maybe the Biden administration will decide to rejoin the TCP. What is it? The T.
Now it is CPTPP.
Trend, whatever it is these days. Yeah. Anyway, maybe they'll decide to rejoin, and that might be kind of interesting. I mean, there is a question about how many of these trade agreements do you actually need, you know, to get something happening and to be effective. My guess is one. You know, if they're going to make any difference, just have one that includes a. I mean, and if having said that, I mean, what's the WTO supposed to be doing? I mean, I thought that was supposed to be the global kind of trade promoting agenda. So if people are serious about wanting to encourage open trade, greater trade, rules-based trade, maybe they should give the WTO a more effective role, because Trump completely undermined that while he was president, because he refused to appoint new commissioners to the WTO to actually allow it to operate properly. So maybe Biden could do that in cooperation with China, and maybe that could be, because we got more than enough of these trade groupings if they actually did something and had a kind of an effective presence. So I don't know how that's going to work out, but I think the RCEP was definitely something that China was comfortable with, because it, you know, they were likely to be the dominant force in that, and didn't find it too threatening at all, as most of these agreements tend not to be in the East Asian region. They don't commit you to doing very much at all, except turning up to meetings in nice places now and again. So, you know, what's not to like, as they say.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Mark Beason, for this very stimulating talk and discussion, sharing with us so many insights and perspectives. And so on behalf of Autonomous University of Lisbon, National Defense Institute, our Asia-Pacific course, and my colleague, Professor Carlos Gaspar,
Thank you.
thank you. And I please ask the audience to give the Zoom applause using the button in the Zoom bar below.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, great to see you again, Luis. And I hope things go well in Portugal. And I look forward to catching up with you sometime in the flesh, I hope, to come back to Portugal. I'd love it.
Yeah.
That would be
Hope to see
great.
you next
Yeah.
week.
All the best.
Take care anyway.
Thank you.
Bye, people. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Aos nossos alunos que teriam agora a aula, o professor Carlos Gaspar, talvez uma pausa de 10 minutos ou 15, veja a que horas quer recomeçar.
Sim. Eu vou ligar de qualquer maneira daqui a 5 minutos e daqui a 10 começamos a aula.
Muito bem.
Tá bem,
Depois
professor. Até já,
colocarei
então.
a gravação da aula do professor Carlos Gaspar também no e-learning e, entretanto, partilharei a gravação desta conferência com o professor Marco Beason para todos.
É.
Então, até a próxima.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Obrigado a todos.
Obrigado.